I'm glad you're enjoying yourself.
We are an army, a radical movement of Christ, full of fire, full of the Spirit, passionate for people, praising and worshiping God in one accord, in one spirit, helping the needy, helping those who are hurting, helping the most vulnerable. We are a praying army. We are a fighting army, an army that fights for justice. We are a soul-winning army. We are the Salvation Army. Tustin Ranch.
To overcome the challenges of poverty. But I remember when we moved to Orange County that in the face of our challenges, one of the first stops that we made early on to shop was at the Salvation Army store in Garden Grove. I can describe the building to you in explicit detail because it was a beacon of hope. It was a place of refuge where we could buy clothing in an affordable manner to be able to carry us through the challenges of life, and through the grace of God and a lot of hard work and a mother who insisted that we would break the cycle of poverty through education. I was the first to graduate college in my family's history for that matter. And so it was a very momentous day, and in time, as an adult, I was able to engage in both a private sector career as a senior executive of one of the largest investor-owned utility companies in the nation, Edison. And I was also in public service, both as a police officer early on in my career, but also went on to serve as a county supervisor in Orange County, elected to that office, as well as a U.S. ambassador to the United Nations agencies. And I was very honored to serve as the director of the Peace Corps for 4.5 years and traveled the globe on behalf of the United States. And over the course of that time, I have served on the National Advisory Board of the Salvation Army with some very distinguished Americans, working, collaborating to advance the great work of the Army on many different levels. And so it has been an honor and a privilege for me to have this abundant blessing in my life where I've been able to work with some amazing leaders like yourselves, and to see how Orange County Salvation Army has been in the transformational business of transforming lives and through the gospel and the teaching of the word, but also creating hope and opportunity in jobs, in transitions, in housing, addressing the issue of homelessness. And so it's a real pleasure to be here and to share in the delight of the great work of the Army.
Ambassador, that is an incredible journey you've been on. I mean, it's such a rich journey, and you've accomplished so many things. So, Ambassador, let me ask you this question, because it's probably a burning question. You were a former police officer, and a lot of people may not know a lot about that. Tell us how long, and tell us a little bit about your experiences as being a police officer here in Orange County.
Well, it was a very unique experience, because for me, and given the journey of my career, both in the private and public sector, it was probably the best foundational experience that I could have had, because in law enforcement, you see the good of people and the great things that people can do, but you also see the dark and evil side of what people can do when committing crimes, when being violent and taking the life of another. I was investigated a number of homicides in the process of being a police officer in the city of Orange, where I grew up. So I not only went to school, both elementary, middle, high school, and eventually college, but I also policed and patrolled the streets of the city where I grew up. It made for a very unique experience, because I knew the neighborhoods, I knew a lot of the people, and some of the people who lived in the community were actually my customers when I was an Orange County Register paper boy. So I went from being their paper boy to being their police officer on patrol in the area, and it was a different time. It was a different era. But I spent years as a full-time officer, as a police cadet, but also as a reserve officer for many years after I left full-time service, and I did so because it gives you a line of sight to communities and a unique window of observation to see how communities grow, how communities evolve, how communities endure challenges and difficult times. And so I'm pleased that while it was not part of the design, that it just happened to be that the police chief at the time saw something in me that in his eyes qualified me to wear a badge in the city in which I grew up, and did so for a number of years and enjoyed it very, very much.
Captain Cheryl.
I'm just like looking as an outsider, only been here for about 3 years. Orange County is a pretty amazing place to live.
It is.
And I personally feel really blessed and privileged to be able to live and to serve the community here. But looking across wider America, we see lots of diversity and lots of division at the moment. And a lot of people make the claim that the United States is a racist society, whereas a lot of people that I come in contact with, that's not my experience. What's your perspective on the current kind of things that we're seeing at the moment, and, you know, is there a racist issue, or is it more the fact that there's an element of people within society who hold some differing kind of views?
I think that racism is a real issue, and it is one that manifests itself in a variety of different ways. Sometimes it's very obvious and it's very apparent, and other ways it's veiled. It's the undercurrent of a community or an individual's sentiments about people of color or a different race, different ethnicity, and so I think it is a real issue that we have to contend with. And the more we understand it and acknowledge it, and have the conversations that need to transpire, that need to occur to surface racism in our country and eradicate it, that is the imperative that I think all of us, I'm of Hispanic origin. My parents, grandparents came to this country from Mexico with aspirations, hopes, dreams. My parents were born in Texas. I was born in Texas, but we moved to California because the Golden State is the land of opportunity after all, and they came here in pursuit of those opportunities. It's not to say we didn't experience racism, that we didn't experience the kinds of words that are said that can be mean-spirited, that can be divisive, and can point to something uglier and darker about our society. But I believe that the times that we are living today are providing an opportunity to come to terms with the realization that it is still amongst us and in our midst, and we have got to do everything within our power to eradicate racism in our country. We are all equal in God's eyes.
Amen.
And we have to come to terms with that reality. And every person of faith should embrace that ideal that whatever your color, whatever your origin, whatever your orientation, your background, we are all God's children. And as a consequence, we ought to embrace that wholly, fully, and every day in our walk across the spectrum of our society.
Yeah. I just said one other thing. One of the things that, like, because I'm moving amongst the community and I'm having these difficult conversations, one of the things that I've been hearing a lot recently is in response to the injustice that we see and the rising tensions, a lot of people are saying to me, "Oh, it's not my responsibility. I didn't do that. I'm not discriminatory, so therefore this issue is not my issue anymore. I don't want to see it, I don't want to hear about it, and I don't want to talk about it." But as you say, in God's eyes, everybody's the same, right?
Absolutely.
When we look at the parable of the Good Samaritan, we see that, you know, it doesn't matter who you are, we should feel compassion. But it seems to be that a lot of people don't want to feel that. So should we be encouraging people to see it, understand it, feel it, touch it, hear about it, even though they may not be discriminatory and they may not have been racist, but we have to talk about it?
Well, there are things like unconscious bias, which in a lot of instances may not be as apparent or as obvious, or may be the kind of person that you just alluded to. Says, "I'm not." But there are individuals who fully believe that they are not, but in behavior, in conduct, or just in phrasing of how things are communicated, clearly connotes some sense of either discomfort or the disqualification of somebody else to a conversation, to a level of engagement because of their color. Or we may bracket people in certain categories. We may generalize people and say, well, they're all like this. Well, they're not all like this. You know, I remember years ago experiencing a situation where I was on an international delegation, and this gentleman who I shall not name for obvious reasons, during the entire trip, referred to me as Jose. I said to him, my name is not Jose, my name is Gaddi. And he would not abandon that reference to my name. And clearly, he was, in my estimation, exhibiting a streak of racism. Whether he may not have known it, he may have thought it was acceptable. He was from another state where those kinds of practices used to be embraced, I think, more openly. But it gave me the opportunity to have a serious conversation with him by the end of the week and to say, you know, I take offense to the fact that you are calling me Jose because it connotes other things to me. And I don't appreciate it because I have a name just as you have one. And just as I've respected you all week by referring to you by your name,
Yes.
I would have appreciated if you had referred to me by my name.
Yeah.
And so those are the kinds of things, as trivial as it sounds, all of us have to commit ourselves to not only check ourselves, and to examine our heart and our soul and come to terms with, well, maybe I do need to learn some lessons in life. Maybe I do need to adjust my thinking, my view, my perspective. And we have to also be willing to call those out around us, whom we love, who we care about, and our friends, our colleagues, our co-workers, to call them out when these kinds of instances occur. And sometimes they're conscious, which is revealing about the person and the individual and the challenges they have, but also sometimes it's not so apparent, but it manifests itself in other ways, and we've got to eradicate that kind of an existence in our society because it's not helpful, it's not healthy, and frankly, it's not godly.
You know, Ambassador, the wounds within the African American community runs very deep. Why is that the case? And how do you feel we should be responding to the pain and suffering that many of our African American friends are experiencing right now?
Well, I think as I've just described, I think we need to have the kind of open dialogue, the kind of open conversations that will help identify not only the symptoms of conflict and issues, but would also hopefully begin the journey toward reconciliation, to identifying what are those societal factors that are contributing to the kinds of decisions and divisions that occur in our society, whether it's in business, as we're seeing corporate America respond to the events of recent days. Yes. And so that's a critical piece of it. But it's also important that each and every one of us invest ourselves in this because frankly, it's a lifelong proposition. This kind of dialogue, this kind of reconciliation, this kind of empathy that we need to have one for the other, that I can extend my hand to you and give you a helping hand or offer you a remedy for your problem, regardless of your color or your background. Those are the kinds of things that we need to overcome. And that is still a work in progress in the United States, and it's also a work in progress in other parts of the world. And we continue to be challenged by all of that. And I've often said, you know, we need to remind ourselves that we all have a permanent or temporary address, and it's called Earth.
Yes.
And we all live on this planet. And yet, we seem to find ways to create conflict and division, and those things need to be overcome. But I think having the dialogue, the narrative, the discussions, and then a plan of action that takes us to a place where not only does government come up or design the policies, the processes to help eradicate those conflicts, to invite or to, I should say, implement new practices in governmental agencies, just as law enforcement is going through the processing or the process of examining the policing that we have in America. And I think most police chiefs of major cities in the country are now embracing the idea that we need to take a national look at policing in America, as we have in previous iterations, but also to look at policing in our local communities, because there are unique aspects of each community that are very distinct and different, whether it's socioeconomic, industrial versus residential. The communities have different profiles, and I think it's imperative to examine what your community looks like, what it feels like, and then you need to police accordingly to be able to get to a great place. My time in law enforcement, we did things that are no longer practiced, that were about community relations, about outreach, about clearly conveying to children, to young people, to our communities that we're here to serve you, we're here to protect you, we're here to be transparent, we're here to be open, because we all live in this community, we all call it home. And that really inspired us to have a profound commitment. And back then, housing costs being what they are, for example, in Orange County, many public safety officers and firefighters live in adjoining counties because of the cost of housing. Yeah. Back in the day when I was in law enforcement, I dare say most of the officers that were part of my department lived in the city in which we worked. So we shopped, we ate, we interacted with the city, and we were part of the department. It was a different era.
Ambassador Gaddi, I'm loving what you're saying, because you're raising some very pertinent questions and issues. What I'm hearing you saying is that just saying policing is the only issue that we're facing right now is far too simplistic. The issues are far more complex. You're talking about housing affordability for our first responders, hence why they can't live in a community, understand it deeper. You're talking about a whole range of community policing and having a different mindset. Now, a lot of people are sitting back and listening to this and say, well, no, the answer is just defunding police and maybe investing in more of those initiatives that you're talking about. But then I'm hearing a lot of police chiefs who say, listen, we don't even have enough money just to do some of the basic things that we need as law enforcement for equipment and resources and training. The problem seems way, way too complex. How do we even begin to tackle the issues surrounding policing across our nation right now?
Well, I think first of all it starts, and I know it sounds generic and it sounds cliche, but we need to have that conversation to identify the strengths and the practices at work in law enforcement agencies. Let's get something squared away right from the get-go, and sometimes it's the obvious, but it needs to be reminded to everyone out there that what we saw happen in Minneapolis to George Floyd was probably one of the most horrific things that I have ever seen. And I've seen some pretty terrible things during my days in law enforcement. That was horrendous. It was horrific in every respect. And as one police chief was quoted as saying, if there's any police officer in America who sees nothing wrong with that image, that officer needs to turn his badge in today. And I fully agree with that. But let's also understand that the majority, vast majority of police officers are honorable men and women who work day and night, make the sacrifices, because as I said to someone, just think of a police officer today, he or she has to go home and explain to their children those horrendous images that we have seen over the last couple of weeks, whether it's Atlanta or it's Minneapolis. They have to take that home and try to then explain it to their children. So my heart goes out to the police officers who are dedicated, committed to the profession of law enforcement, because they are the great men and women who protect our society and frankly keep the civil society that we celebrate as a great nation. So I think it's important then to make that distinction and identify the practices that are working, where bridges are being built with communities that create the confidence, the openness, the transparency, and the ability of the officers to interact with with their communities. So it will take a collective use of the great minds in our society,
Yes.
in our nation, both in law enforcement, both in as well as the corporate sector, as well as public policymakers at every level, to be able to navigate these very challenging and difficult times in which we live. As I was sharing with you before we went on camera, I saw two little boys. They looked like they were twins. They must have been 5 or 6 years old, and they were both wearing masks. And it just struck me at the moment. I thought, you know, what will they tell their children 25, 30 years from now when they recount this era in which we live, where we are facing not only a pandemic,
Yes.
but we have seen this horrendous act of violence and others that have occurred previously and since then, that have called our attention to a very grave and serious problem that needs to be addressed in our nation, and that is, how do we relate to each other, and how do we exist as people with each other, supporting, loving, caring about each other, a willingness to extend our hand when there are times of need,
Yes.
to the exclusion of none and the inclusion of all.
Yes.
That's the imperative.
It's interesting, you spoke a little bit ago about how Jesus sees everybody as equal, and how this is our temporary address and our permanent address is at home in eternity.
That's right.
And I was actually reflecting today, Matthew chapter 25, where Jesus talks about when he meets you at the gates of heaven, and he says, you know, he talks about separating people between the sheep and the goat. And he says, you know, when I was hungry, you fed me. When I was naked, you clothed me. When I was in prison, you came and visited me. And they said, but when did I do this? It kind of reminds me about now. Like, it's almost like we have some acceptable need in our community, the homeless, the alcoholics, all those kind of things. But the minute that we want to start talking about race and bias and all of that kind of stuff, there is an element that says that I really don't want to talk about that. I don't want to see that as an acceptable form of need. But Jesus wouldn't say that, would he?
That's right.
He would say that every single person, regardless of race, ethnicity, regardless of culture, regardless of religion or anything like that, everybody is valuable to him. That's why he came. And because it's valuable to him, then it should be valuable to us.
Absolutely.
You know.
And someone said, I wish I could attribute it to myself, but I really can't. But I did listen to someone the other day who said, you know, when we come into this world, we don't know where life's journey is going to take us. And for some, like myself, as the son of migrant farm workers, I had a tremendous grounding of faith despite the poverty. We were channeled to believe, and my dad's belief was constant. When we were short on stuff, his simple response was, God will provide. And it got to the point where I just said, I'm just tired of hearing God will provide, you know, because I need the money. I don't want to hear God will provide. I need the money to do this or to do that. But he was right, because in every instance, God did provide. And ultimately, we were able then to take a journey that gave us a good means of living, but also never forgetting that we are each commissioned to do good for our brothers and sisters, to do something for our community, to brighten the light in someone's darkened room or life, to bring hope, to bring aspirations where darkness exists, where people are hoping to do great things in life. And sometimes you achieve them and sometimes you don't, but we are all, as the scriptures say, we are wonderfully and marvelously made. Yeah. And in that context, we should learn to be somewhat content with who we are, but recognizing that we are all flawed. Yes. And that we all have blind spots, that we all have shortcomings, and we need to acknowledge that. And when it comes to the subject of racism and discrimination and the kind of manifestations that make for very, very bad societal relations, all of us need to commit ourselves to eradicating that kind of mindset, whether it's ours individually. Look, I remember growing up in Orange, and there's a famous case, legal case, landmark case in Orange County, Mendez versus the Board of Education.
Yes.
And I will tell you, I've grown up in Orange County. I've gone to Orange County schools. I was never taught about the segregation that occurred in Orange County of Mexican children and the school districts, and how the schools were segregated, that the Mexican kids were relegated to one building on the campus and the non-Mexican kids were relegated to the other. And I came across it because one of those children who had grown up to be an adult told me about it.
Wow.
I was aghast. I said, what? Right here in Orange? My city where I grew up? I said, I never heard that in history or in high school or in college. Tell me more. And I couldn't believe it when he shared the story with me in very explicit terms about how he was relegated to collect the paper and pencils. And I was just so taken aback, and I thought to myself, why was I not taught that when I was in school?
Yeah.
That should be part of the teaching, so that we learn from that to never allow that to ever happen again, that we would segregate children on the basis of their color, their ethnicity. And to me, that has remained with me years, decades ago when he first shared that story with me, that is the imperative, that we learn from the lessons, whether it was when we were at war and we had the Japanese Americans who were rounded up and sent off to camps and whatnot. We need to learn from all of those things, acknowledge that those were tragic, tragic mistakes that should not have been made, and learn from that so that they don't repeat themselves.
Yeah. When you were introducing yourself, you were talking about a cycle of poverty and how you committed yourself to being educated to break that cycle of poverty. Do you think it's as simple as access to education is an answer to the problems that we're seeing, or is it more than just that?
Well, I think it can be a combination. As I said, when you're born into this world, you don't know where the journey is going to take you. I could have easily ended up being the next generation of migrant farm workers in my family and would have kept that going, but fortunately, at my mother's insistence, neither my father or mother graduated from high school. But somehow they inspired or somehow had this revelation that education was going to be the path out of that cycle of poverty. And so she was very insistent that we would, that graduating from high school would in and of itself be a massive achievement. Graduating from college was almost unthinkable because economics being what they are and so forth. But we did, and I was the first generation in my family ever to graduate from a college or university. And so I think it's one of the ways, but the reality is that I've known many, many good friends who have small businesses who have not gone to college but have a vocational occupational skill, and they have built tremendous businesses, enterprises for themselves, for their families, creating job opportunities, and in the process helping others. But what I believe is really important in our society is that when you are someone who has achieved great success, particularly if you're a person of color, is to never forget where you came from, and that you hold the door open for others who are seeking to come through that same door that you were able to come through, to hold it open so that they too can achieve the same kind of realization of dreams, hopes, and aspirations. You know, our nation, our country is the greatest country on earth. It is not without its flaws. It is not without its blemishes. But I will tell you, having traveled to dozens and dozens and dozens of countries around the world as a director of the Peace Corps and as a U.S. ambassador, that this is still a country where you can realize dreams, hopes, aspirations, and it is a unique place where you can actually start, you can fail, and you can start over again. And you can fail, and you can start over again. There are many countries on earth where you cannot fail and start over again, fail and start over again. So it's a land of possibilities, but in order to create the possibilities for all, we have to work, commit ourselves to eradicating racism, segregation, and the kinds of societal ills that deprive people of the opportunity to have an equal access, an equal opportunity to fight for what is right.
Ambassador, we're going to keep on continuing in our conversation, but I just want to take a moment to remind our viewers, if you have questions, this is interactive. We want to give you an opportunity to join us by asking your questions directly to the ambassador. I'm sure there's many of you out there who've got some burning questions, so we want to give you that opportunity. Ambassador, you said something a moment ago in the conversation, and I got to tell you, I'm finding this incredibly enlightening. I never knew we had at some point historically in Orange County there was segregation. That's enlightening. I wish I learned that. I want to learn that. I actually want to ask you more questions about that, maybe offline. But equal access to the same level of education is often asked or associated with injustice. How do we begin, and I know your love for education and your desire to see young people educated, how do we begin to address those issues in our society? Because we see in poorer communities across the United States, school districts, the level of access to the same quality of education is not comparable with some of the more affluent areas across the United States. How do we begin to address those issues?
Well, I think it's an interesting question because I think there are a lot of leaders in the higher academic area who are also asking the same question. In an evolving society where technology is evolving at such a fast pace, what kind of labor force do you produce to meet the demands and the opportunities and the challenges of the new age labor market? In the sense that, as we all know, I think, or anyone who has studied this, and I've spent a few hours on it, serving on the Board of Trustees at Chapman University and also on the Board of Governors of the California State University Foundation, is that you've got to have the coursework and the availability of learning that has application to the new job market. And what's interesting today is that there are jobs that we know today that will not exist 5 years
Correct.
from now. And there are jobs that do not exist today that will exist 5 years from now. So the question is, how do you evolve the educational academic system? I think that's one of the aspects that needs to be addressed. And I know that many institutions across America are grappling with it. Some are starting to question the merits of a college degree. Is a college degree really necessary? Well, thus far the statistics show that the earning potential for someone with a college degree is still greater than someone who does not have a college degree. So I think it's important to assess those aspects. I think it's important to renew the commitment to funding education, particularly at the public school levels, that is to say middle school, high school, so that the students who graduate from those levels of schooling are proceeding through our educational system with a proficiency in reading, writing, math, because there is evidence, statistics that show that there are shortcomings in the system that are not producing students that can be competitive in a college or university environment. And then the other aspect is, as I can attest to, is a community college experience. Community colleges are the most diverse student body in America. It is a gateway for those who perhaps cannot make the leap from high school to a university or college immediately to transition through a community college and then be able to go on to higher education. But it is very complicated because technology is overtaking so many different aspects of jobs that automation, as an example, is changing the world of manufacturing and industrial production. The fact that we import so much that is produced and manufactured in other places. I think we are complemented by the fact that we still remain a global center of innovation, whether it's a Silicon Valley or other places across the nation where we have some of the greatest minds, greatest thinkers of the future. But it is a very, very challenging time and a dilemma because on top of everything else, you have the cost of education, which is also another critical issue that we're trying to address in society, but it speaks for continuing support of the university, the public university systems that are providing the kind of education, the kind of grounding that young people need to be able to be competitive in a very, very complex job market and a very complex future.
Because some may argue that there is certain segments of our community, our poorer communities, which generally tend to be communities that have a predominant number of African American or Hispanics who don't have the same accessibility to education as many from the non-colored groups of our community.
I think that's something we kind of take for granted because when this pandemic started, all of our learning shifted online. And Nesan and I have 4 children, 1 in college, 1 in high school, and 2 in elementary school. And the Unified School District were rushing and trying to get devices to children who don't have devices at home.
Correct.
They're trying to get hotspots for the internet to children who don't even have access to the internet at home. I think, and when I was thinking about it, what portion of our society would not have access to the internet at home? It's the poorer section of our community, and in this area, it's this Hispanic section.
Right.
So we are facing a crisis.
Well, you identify an issue that I was actually involved in a few weeks ago, because this whole subject of the digital divide came up.
It's true.
That if you think it's bad in these areas, imagine in the rural areas of, say, the Central Valley of California, where you have poverty, the kind of poverty I lived in as a child.
Yes.
But also, in addition to that, you have the digital divide, no access to the internet, and the lack of devices to hook onto the internet and log onto the internet. What we are grappling with or gaining here is knowledge of things that we need to focus on, like the digital divide, the lack of accessibility, because we presume that if we have it, well, everybody must have it, because it's so basic. If you walk around, everybody seems to have a device. Everybody seems to have an iPad or access to a laptop. The reality is that there are families and children, particularly if there are multiple children in a household, who don't have that individual device to be able to operate from. I know some teachers who are virtual teachers now, and I know of some who are teachers to teach the teachers on how to be a good virtual teacher, because not everybody has the calling to be a virtual teacher.
Correct.
You're not in the room anymore. The children are not in front of you any longer. Now you're looking into a lens, and your audience is out there, or maybe you're seeing their images through Zoom, but you've got to reform the way that you educate and teach these children. My personal concern is that in a year or 2 or 3, we are going to look back on this period of time, and we will have had time to assess what negative impacts or detrimental impacts did the pandemic and the times that we lived in, when children had to be online, what are the implications of their level of learning? Did it decrease? Did it increase? Did it stay the same? And so those are issues that we're still going to have to deal with going forward. But what we're seeing in this time in which we're living is we are seeing symptoms, societal symptoms and situations that maybe were not as apparent as they were before, or they existed, but they never surfaced to the top.
Correct.
And became so obvious and so apparent.
Because I think that's probably what we're looking at right now. The pandemic has brought to the surface a lot of issues that existed. So we're looking at the digital divide. There are some children's education who will be poorer as a result of a digital age.
Correct.
Unfortunately, it's based on poverty, and in some cases, poverty is based on race. I think the rise of racism and the cry of injustice, we've had time to stop and to think, and things that we wouldn't normally see or pay attention to are very apparent to us because we don't have other things clouding our mind at the moment. Basically the whole country has paused. We're paying attention to things that we weren't paying attention to before, and all of a sudden they're here, they're in our face. I think the problem, the questions that we have to ask ourselves are, how are we going to respond to those problems? What is an appropriate response? Is it okay to say, not my problem, or is it not okay to say that?
No, it's not okay to say that, because when I was in public office as an elected official, I would say to people, there are some decisions that you have to make that are pay me now or pay me later propositions. That is to say, if you don't want to allocate the dollars to solve this problem today, it's going to cost you a whole lot more 5 or 10 years from now, when you then have to foot the bill to provide services, to provide support, to build more jails, more facilities for incarceration, and all the other consequences that we see societally when we don't prepare children, young people, to be competitive in a very competitive market. And with globalization, it's even more complicated. So there is an imperative to seize the information that we are deriving from this challenging period in our lives as Americans, and take that data, that information, and translate it into public policy and funding that will address these issues. I believe in this great country of ours. We are resilient, we are capable, but we've got to be willing to acknowledge that we've got to help each other to be able to sustain a quality of life that is fair and equitable and accessible to all. Because, as I like to say, everybody has not had an equal chance to live on Main Street, USA. And in my lifetime, that's my aspiration, is to work toward getting everybody to have a chance to live on Main Street, USA.
Ambassador, Cheryl and myself, prior to coming to the United States, had traveled to South Africa. And we had visited townships, and we had seen people in some, as you said, around the world, you can see abject poverty.
Absolutely.
Whereas here in the United States, we are so privileged in so many ways. We were confronted by the homelessness that was really strongly demonstrated or visible around Angel Stadium and on the riverbed. And now as we pause, we're confronted with issues or questions about equal access to education and the digital disadvantage that so many families have, which is all giving rise to the injustice we're seeing around our society and our world. What should we expect from our political leaders at a city level, at a county level, at a state level, at a national level at this time? What should we as Americans expect from them?
Well, I think it's not, yes, there's some level of expectation that we should have, but it has to be a collaborative effort of public policymakers, the funds that are made available to eradicate and deal with some of the issues that we're contending with as a society, that create conflicts, that create disharmony, that create homelessness, that lack the funding to provide food to working, for example, to working poor families. This is the profile that really tugs at my heart, the working poor. That is the men and women who actually go to work every day,
yes,
but cannot afford a roof over their heads, and their children are in jeopardy, and they are in jeopardy in the process. It takes a collaboration of the collective force and strength of nonprofit organizations, faith-based organizations, the faith community, the corporate sector, all of us coming together, because at the end of the day, we will all somehow, somewhere, incur, feel, sense, or suffer the consequences of what we see. And to turn a blind eye to, say, the case of the homeless does not solve the problem. The opportunity to reach out to others has to be one that we own. And I will tell you that, having been the director of the Peace Corps, I was inspired, I was motivated, and I fully believe in the young people of today. I really do.
Yes.
Because I think they, unlike previous generations, have had a line of sight to the challenges of our society in ways that maybe we didn't have, or it came much later in life. But I talk to young people all the time in my various capacities, and they are looking for opportunities to not only be good citizens at home, yes, in America, but how do I make my world a better place? Because they've come to understand that the consequences of ignoring the rest of the world while we focus everything here, which we should make priority one, but not at the expense of ignoring the fact that we are part of a community of nations.
Yes.
And as a consequence, we need to take that into account. And so I remain optimistic that younger generations of people, and as we've seen over the last couple of weeks, multiracial groups of protesters and demonstrators who have taken to the streets of America to exercise their constitutional right as Americans and to convey to the world and to public policymakers that we are in an era of transformation and change, and I want to be heard. And I think that future generations of voters, I pray, are going to assume their rightful role in American society, in this democracy that we call home, to assume that responsibility and that role, and not only to hold the policymakers accountable, but also to hold themselves accountable, because that's my sense. Because when I talk to young people, they say, so you've been director of the Peace Corps, you've been a U.S. ambassador, you've been an elected office holder, what should I be doing to make make my world a better place? I love it when they ask those kinds of questions, because it says to me that there is an appetite, there is a hunger to want to build a future of solidarity, of opportunity, and equal opportunity for all who make up the fabric of this great society.
I mean, there's a lot of people, though, that would argue that racism doesn't exist because we have the Civil Rights Act and all of this kind of stuff. The legislation creates equality and all of this. But we talked a little bit before about conscious and unconscious bias. We talked about how that legislation's applied. The legislation is only applied if corporately people agree with it and hold it in high regard. If they carry this unconscious bias, if they carry these even conscious bias, then the legislation is meaningless.
Well, it is, but fortunately we have a court system that is in place to be able to enforce that. And also I think some would argue that sometimes the criminal justice system has not served people of color well, has not served minorities well, and has had its moments where we've seen some discriminatory practices and sentencing in other areas. But I think that, again, if we hold ourselves accountable, if we hold our public policymakers accountable, and we work collectively as a society, I'm not naive. I came out of poverty, but I grew up believing in this country. I'll share a story with you. When I was a little boy, I was maybe, I think it was like 12 years old, 12 years old. I was a corporate shoeshine boy to one of the largest companies here in this county. And my job every Friday afternoon was to shine the shoes of the CEO and chairman of this multinational company. And I would shine his shoes every afternoon at 2 o'clock. And I was a paper boy, Orange County Register. But I grew up in an environment where people created opportunities and possibilities for me. I had a school teacher who saw something in me that I couldn't even see in myself. And she took an interest in me and helped me catapult me to levels of academic accomplishment that I had no idea. And in fact, I was sort of a rebellious kid in her class. And somehow she was able to harness that rebellion and all that energy, negative energy, and make it into positive energy. And I can give you dozens and dozens and dozens, probably hundreds of examples of Latino students that I know and others who have traveled that same kind of journey. And we've got to learn from those experiences. We have to provide the kind of resources that are needed in our society to work in those arenas, in those areas, which are more likely than not to produce productive citizens of this country who will contribute to the betterment, but we'll never lose sight of the fact, as I said a little while ago, of where they came from. Because assuming you never forget where you came from, it will help you understand where you're going.
I mean, the lessons of history, right? The lessons of history are our greatest teachers. If we forget our history, if we forget the things that happened in the past and we don't learn from them and we don't apply those lessons to today, then society will end up being worse than it was before.
And young people today have access to knowledge and databases on the internet and so forth to learn about history, to learn about public policy, to learn how to go, active through social media channels and portals and create the kind of momentum that we've seen over the last couple of weeks in this country. And I think that as I also, contemplate this era in which we're living, gosh, I've said, you could have written this as a Hollywood script a year ago and nobody in Hollywood would have bought it because nobody would have believed it. And here we are, a pandemic, all of these events that we've talked about, whether it's Minneapolis or Atlanta and so forth, and the demonstrations. And I commented to someone the other day and I said, and the tragedy is that this is probably the time that we most need to be looking at each other, talking to each other, but we're having to wear masks, impeding our ability to see what is so important, and that is the facial reaction and expressions of people to what we say and how we confront all of these challenges we're facing right now, and an economy that is obviously very challenged. All of those things are being evaluated, assessed, discussed, either on things like Zoom or behind a mask. And I don't know that it gets any tougher than that kind of circumstance to try to address the kinds of issues that we're confronting right now in American history.
So, Ambassador, I'd love for you to look at our audience today behind the camera. And the question that you started to answer, and I want you to answer, is young Americans are saying, well, how do we respond? How do we begin to resolve the challenges that we are facing at this point in time? With all of your knowledge, experience, and wisdom, how would you respond to them?
Well, I would say that the first recommendation I would make is that each and every one of us take ownership for our own behavior, our beliefs, and that which is the grounding that makes us who we are as individuals.
Okay.
That we work without ceasing to eradicate the practices of discrimination, segregation, of creating the divides that create the racial strife and challenges that we are seeing manifested in various parts of our country. And I would say that civic engagement is so critically important, because voting and participating in the electoral process is the equalizer in our society.
Yes.
The ballot doesn't recognize your balance sheet, your income level, your whatever. We are all equal in our electoral system, and it's important to do that. But I would also say that whatever your faith, whatever your belief, I also believe that it is important to pray for our nation.
Yes.
We are all Americans.
Yes.
We are blessed to live in the greatest nation in the history of mankind. It's not without its blemishes, it's not without its flaws, it's not without its missteps, but we need to pray for our nation. I was reading earlier today how the father of our nation, George Washington, went to prayer when he couldn't find answers in the political debate of his time.
Yeah.
President Lincoln was very open that when he couldn't find the answers and the solutions to the challenges of his time, he went to prayer. Yeah. And I think that whatever our belief, whatever our faith, is taking pause to pray for our nation, because when we pray for our nation, we're praying for our neighbor. We're praying for that person down the street who is suffering from racial discrimination, who is enduring the challenges of life today, who is unemployed, who is being challenged, or their children. If we pray as a collective society, I am told through the scriptures that he will hear us and he will answer our prayers. If we humble ourselves and we seek his face and we pray, we will get the answers that we need. But we must do this in order to be able to bring our good thoughts, our hopes, and our aspirations to a better place. And from that, we will emerge stronger and better and more vibrant.
Ambassador, I want to say thank you for spending some time with us in the sacred conversation this hour. We recognize that much more conversation needs to happen. We recognize that we do have hope, that the challenge before us is not overwhelming, because we know where our authority comes from and we know who is in control of our destination. So today we want to say thank you. Thank you, Cheryl. I felt that the discussion was really rich. Is there any final things that you would like to say, Ambassador, before we conclude in our time together?
Well, I just want to thank you for having me, and to say that the Salvation Army is a true blessing, not only to Orange County, but to the nation and to the world. And I am very proud of my affiliation, because I've had the opportunity to visit a number of Kroc centers, which are, of course, a product of the Salvation Army and the generosity of Ray and Joan Kroc, that I have seen the transformational power of God's hand in the lives of men and women across the nation, people of all colors, of all backgrounds, who were enduring and suffering, whether it's drug addiction, homelessness, name it, and they experienced it, whose lives have been transformed by virtue of the great work of the Salvation Army. So I really applaud what you are doing for us here in Orange County. I'm proud to be a partner in that endeavor, and I pray that you will continue to be strong and robust in everything that you do. And above all else, I know that you are doing God's work in the right way.
Amen.
Amen.
Well, God bless you, friends. Next Friday, we will tune again to continue our conversation. I trust that you have enjoyed being challenged by Ambassador Gaddi and his wisdom, his counsel to us as a nation at this particular hour. There's much work to be done, but I believe that God is for us, then nothing can be against us. God bless you, and take care.